Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this online conference organised by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. My name is Rosa Donovan, and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Brussels-based publication AgriFacts. The theme of this online gathering is the Food, Climate, Biodiversity Nexus. Is the European Green Deal on the right track? I think you would agree that this debate is particularly timely, given that discussions on the flagship Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, particularly the headline targets, are going up a gear. Before we get started, we would like to say a quick thank you to the Forum's founding partners, the European Landowners Organisation ELO and Syngenta, as well as the Forum's strategic partners, Cargill, the Nature Conservancy, Thought for Food, IUCN, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and the World Wildlife Fund. Before I introduce my distinguished panellists, I would like to walk through some housekeeping rules and the running order, if I may. The opening address and panel debate will continue until around 6:20 p.m., after which point I will ask a couple of questions myself to each of the individual panellists. From around 6:35 p.m., I will open the floor for questions for those of you participating here in the room with myself, and also those participating online. And you can send your questions to me directly via the question box for those of you participating online, which should be visible now once you scroll down to the bottom of the page. I would ask you to keep your questions short and to be sure to introduce yourself and indicate to whom the question is addressed. We aim to wrap up the question and answer session at around 10 to 7, at which point I will invite Dr. Peter Stroh-Schneider, Chairman of the German Commission on the Future of Agriculture, to deliver his closing address. And Dr. Peter Stroh-Schneider is waiting patiently online, and we have a good connection with him. So I would like to point out that this web-streamed conference is being recorded and will be available on the Forum's website, www.forumforagriculture.com. And we are, of course, available on Twitter, so feel free to be part of the debate at ForumforAg. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Erik Matthijs from the University of Leuven, who in a moment will deliver the opening address on the key lessons from the first 18 months of the Farm to Fork strategy. Erik Matthijs is a professor at the Faculty of Bioscience Engineering at the University of Leuven and is also the Vice Dean of Education. Erik started out his stellar academic career as a research associate over 30 years ago, rising through the ranks to become Professor of Agricultural and Resource Economics in 2006. You're also the director of this university's Sustainable Food Economies research group since 2016. So, Professor, the floor is yours. Please take to the podium.
Thank you. Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe, and in fact the world as a whole, was in need of bags. BAG stands for big, hairy, audacious goals, a term often used in business. Bags to tackle the enormous challenges we are facing in the food, climate, biodiversity nexus. We also realized that to reach these bags requires integrated, systems-wide approaches. And this is echoed in the repeated calls for breaking disciplinary silos in academics, but also in policymaking. And in integrated food policy, a concept launched now some years ago and being realized right now. So in short, repeated calls for a genuine paradigm shift. End of 2019, such big, hairy, audacious goals were presented in the EU's Green Deal, followed by the Farm to Fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy in May 2020. And these goals are clear in that by 2030, pesticide use needs to be reduced with 50%, nutrient losses also with 50%, fertilizer use with 20%, while the share in farmland of organic farming needs to be increased up to 25% EU-wide, and protected land up to 30%, just to name the most important targets of the Green Deal. So these are certainly big, hairy, audacious goals. But since the launch of the Green Deal strategies, stakeholders have been investing a lot of effort in both legitimizing, but also delegitimizing these goals. Efforts that culminated even in a small, we could call it JRC study gate, in the wake of the vote in the European Parliament a couple of weeks ago, last October. So the question begs whether these are indeed the right targets, the right goals, or whether these goals are not too hairy, to stay within the BAG jargon. And additionally, the question also rises whether these strategies truly represent the badly needed integrated approaches. So let me first address the issues of goals and targets. An important critique on the CAP, approved today, is that it insufficiently takes into account, or it is insufficiently taking an outcome or a result-based approach. In other words, money may be spent on with the intention of, for example, improving biodiversity, without actually achieving results or sufficient results on the ground. You all know that critique. Hence, the CAP may have delivered on some goals, like employment, but not enough on other goals like biodiversity. It seems that the farm to fork and the biodiversity strategies follow the same alley. That is, they insufficiently make use of outcome-based approaches, I think. They rather use these intermediary parameters to formulate goals. So it's not about greenhouse gases or human health impacts or biodiversity impacts of pesticide use or nitrogen excess. That's not the goals and the targets that are mentioned. So rather, it's the focus is on input use, pesticides and fertilizers, and one specific production method, organic. Now, for those of you in Brussels and also in Europe in general, this has not come to a surprise, to be quite honest, given two reasons. One is the layered approach to European policymaking, which means that only a step-by-step approach towards policy change is possible in Brussels. But the other reason is also the difficulty of getting data, and I'll be coming back to that a couple of times in my introduction. The difficulty of getting the right data, particularly in an area like biodiversity, but also in many other areas. So that makes it difficult to find targets that one can measure. Specifically, the target of 25% of farmland under organic farming seems particularly big, hairy, and audacious, given that our starting point is, about 9%, I think, 9 or 10% now. So that's a huge challenge. The rationale of promoting organic farming seems mainly to promote biodiversity. But what about the impact on land use and greenhouse gases? The issue of trade-offs pops up here. And I will come back to that in a minute, because I think that the issue of trade-offs and how to deal with trade-offs, that we should spend more time on that. And of course, the legitimacy of these targets has been particularly questioned by the famous studies, pointing to production decline that would result from these combined targets. I'll also come back to that in a minute. But let me first dwell on the second question, the second issue, that is, do the farm-to-fork strategy and the biodiversity strategy represent an integrated approach, even a paradigm shift? Now, reading the communication, I would say yes. And I quote from the farm-to-fork strategy, that it is a new comprehensive approach to how Europeans value food sustainability. For me, that is indeed a big, hairy, audacious statement. So I'll repeat it. The farm-to-fork strategy is a new comprehensive approach to how Europeans value food sustainability. I think that's an impressive statement. In addition, we can read, and I quote again, it is clear that the transition will not happen without a shift in people's diet. It is written in the strategy. And another quote, efforts to tighten sustainability requirements in the EU food system should be accompanied by policies that help raise standards globally in order to avoid the externalization and the export of unsustainable practices. So consumption and trade are clearly recognized as critical success factors. And in the biodiversity strategy, we read that nature protection and restoration is critical for economic recovery, and that the business case for biodiversity is compelling. So yes, I would say that the Green Deal strategies do represent a possible paradigm shift, an integrated approach that acknowledges that for change to happen, the whole system is needed, including consumption and trade. But as I indicated earlier, this approach is not well reflected in the chosen targets, nor maybe even in the proposed actions, particularly in the area of consumption and trade. as actions here may be, a bit shallow, a bit weak. Inform the consumer so she makes better choices. Convince our trade partners to raise standards. Will that be enough? Particularly if we consider that voluntary dietary change is a very slow process that takes decades. And let me refer to a recent exercise carried out by the JRC. It's not it's not the study. Sorry, I slipped my slip of the tongue. Not a study, but the Policy Lab, consisting of a set of participatory sessions between March and June 2021, with 44 stakeholders, and I was very happy to be one of them, aiming to explore the possible building blocks for the legislative framework that should be built to support the Farm to Fork strategy. It's actually action number 1 of the Farm to Fork strategy. That reflection paper that came out of that process will be published soon, I hope. I'm sure. It has been a tremendous effort to grasp the full complexity of the food system. So it's really something you should read when it comes out. And just to pick out one of the things that the paper emphasizes is that the first building block the paper claims we need is a comprehensive sustainability assessment framework. Not only to measure impact, to support policy, but also for the development of sustainability standards within the EU and globally. Other building blocks refer to transparency in the food system, remind my note about data availability, to policy coherence, an old ill in Brussels, and to trade, to name a few. Now, on a personal note, we do not only need a framework to monitor progress towards sustainability, but we also need mechanisms to deal with those trade-offs. Food production versus environmental outcomes, greenhouse gases versus biodiversity, animal welfare versus greenhouse gases, nitrogen versus greenhouse gases, and so on. I mean, not all measures have win-win-win implications. There are trade-offs within the EU and internationally. And I hinted earlier, of course, also that even in organic farming such trade-offs exist. So we need clearinghouse mechanisms that deal with these trade-offs, because such trade-offs may push actors in a certain direction that may be detrimental for other dimensions, or even lead to leakage, whatever that leakage may be. Or it may lead to underinvestment in other directions. Take carbon farming. It's not only good for the climate, it's also good for many other things. It's good for biodiversity, it's good for farm resilience. So we should also look to the combined effects. It's not only about trade-offs, it is about synergies. But I would like to warn for singling out a specific area, because they're all interrelated. And such trade-offs may also hold us back to go forward, and we need to go forward fast. So let me conclude with a couple of words on the Farm to Fork studies that have hit the spotlight the last couple of months. Again, a quote from the JRC report, infamous by now, which says it all. This is not an impact assessment of the strategies as such. The modeling scope does not include all the strategies' measures. It doesn't include food waste reduction target. It doesn't include dietary shifts. It doesn't include the organic action plan. Not all policies that affect the transitions are captured by this model, and it's the same story more or less with the other studies. They suffer from similar limitations, but where are these limitations coming from? Well, they're mainly due to the fact that knowledge and modeling of the food system is immensely biased towards the agricultural production side of the food system. We have incredibly detailed information on farming at the level of parcels and animals, using the Future Farm Sustainability Data Network, using satellites, registration data, what have you. But we have hardly any information on consumption, and particularly on what's happening in the middle, between primary production and consumption. The level of storage, processing, retail, wholesale. Which is why more transparency will have to be part of a successful Green Deal. So how then should we look at these studies at all? Well, the JRC report itself suggests the way forward, and I quote, impacts should be considered representing an upper bound of the full impact of the strategies, as they are partial in scope. So therefore, I propose not to consider these studies as a form of impact assessment, simply because they are not, but to consider them as a set of plausible scenarios exploring the future. Plausible scenarios that result from different courses of action. And then we can analyze and consider the consequences of these various scenarios. We should identify actions that actually prevent us from ending up in that scenario. Actually, that's probably what we're doing right now. Especially when, of course, that scenario has too many undesirable consequences. Lack of competitiveness, leakage to third countries, and so on. Now, the JRC study points to these consequences when insufficient action is taken in consumption and trade. We'll learn about another study, the TIFA study, offers an alternative scenario. In this respect, modeling dietary change. But then the question, of course, is how to achieve that dietary change within the time frame of 9 years. So what we need is actually more scenarios. I'm missing a scenario in which, for example, more elaborate adoption of technologies and practices is modeled, beyond what is assumed in the current studies. For example, the GRC study says, well, within the current cap, this is what will happen. Within the next cap, this is what will happen. But what about the green taxonomy? What will the green taxonomy set in motion, right? What will the possibility for farmers to valorize carbon credits, not only in the cap, but also in markets, set in motion? Maybe we can accelerate some, and technologies, please understand me in a very broad way. It could mean agri-ecological technologies, precision farming, the whole set available. So ladies and gentlemen, time is not on our side. 2030 is less than 9 years ahead. So let us invest our collective energy in putting the pieces of the puzzle together and realize the big, hairy, audacious goals of making our global food system sustainable and resilient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Well, I think it's fair to say that you provided a very good tour d'horizon there of what you refer to as big, hairy, audacious goals. And I'd just like to pick out one or two elements, if I may. You're very clear in admitting and conceding that these models that have, as you say, attracted so much attention and been in the spotlight of late have their limitations. So you are on the same page, I would imagine, as your companion Tassa Saniotis, that these should not be considered as Bibles, that they have their limitations, and that for the most part they are based on primary production. Now, could you sort of tease out, maybe you mentioned data, access to data is a black box, you say, in terms of we have tons of information on the parcels at agricultural level. Where are the missing links in the chain? You're talking about further along the supply chain, but how would that add to our conversation?
Well, there's two things when we consider the rest of the system. One, of course, there is enormous complexity. I mean, agricultural goods go to the consumers in various ways, various channels, with all kinds of configurations that are more difficult to grasp, to model than agricultural production, which we now model with sufficient detail. So that complexity is one thing. But then you have to put data on that complexity. We need to know what are the financial streams, for example, which is, of course, confidential information that most companies are not willing to share. So the transparency on not only prices, because prices is only one element, but also volumes, contract terms. I mean, there's so many elements that make the food system work, or that actually block the food system from working in an inclusive way, that we have, it's a big black box especially for academics.
One point you made, actually, do you sense as an academic, and we discussed this before we went live, that there's a disconnect somewhere between sort of the aspirations in this farm-to-fork communication and this strategy, and then when you go into the finer detail, you refer there to the actions outlined in the annex. I mean, obviously, this is something that Nathalie Schaz will be discussing in more detail later, that these will all be teased out in legislative proposals over the next 24 months or so. But do you see that there needs to be more sort of concrete links between what is presented in the strategy towards a sustainable and resilient food system and what sort of is coming down the tracks?
That's obvious, right? If you have a strategy, I mean, I was also involved in looking at the bioeconomy strategy, which kind of suffered from the same problem. It's a strategy, but it needed to be linked to various legislative pieces, directives and so on. The same has to occur now. But I think an important element, and I don't know whether my colleagues will talk about this, is that if you talk, for example, about the consumer, well, that's a member state, to a great extent, still a member state issue rather than a European issue. So the question is also to what extent Europe has all the levers to make it happen, and whether there are not big holes in some of these levers. So we need the member states to come on board as well. I'll be looking forward how that's going to play out in the next couple of months.
And surely as well, this idea of consumers, the role of consumers, which will be discussed by two panellists or later on in the discussion, how those kind of patterns and trends, how they form sort of policy decisions as well, and that has to be taken on board. But my last question before I turn to my panellists is this JRC piece of work that you referred to, that you were part of this process as 44 policy experts, this Concepts for a Sustainable EU Food System. What will that add to the conversation then?
Well, it's been an exercise in itself. It wasn't an academic exercise. All types of stakeholders were there. It was unfortunately an online exercise. So we had to do everything online, but its merit is especially in its comprehensiveness. It puts everything on the table without any reservation. It puts all the bottlenecks on the table, I hope it will be a good starting point to take the next step forward in dialogue with all the stakeholders.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll look forward to that in due time, and soon, I hope, as you say. So thank you very much, Professor, for that introduction.